very much. It's kind of like old home week now that I've been back east for a few years and got to know many of you. I had a very pleasant time last night, and good discussion with Jonathan riding back from Milwaukee, and a busy day and a lot of discussion today on some Civil War topics with some old friends. And for everybody that came up here tonight, that may not have been on other times because I was here. I greatly appreciate it. I did try to put this together to work with the tour. Ray was very kind and gave me an early idea of where we were going on the tour. Most of what I'm going to show you here is probably places some of you as many times as you've probably been in that area. And I want to thank Sam for coming up too. I forgot to say it, and his wife. I've known Sam for a long time since he was working on his 12th Illinois book, and it's great to see him as well. So some things that will work with the tour that you will probably not see on the tour. They're not areas where you're going to get a bus or two. There may be areas where we'll do a drive-by or something. Maybe someone can point them out, but they work with the cavalry. And it's also, it makes it easy for me to come up to Chicago and do a cavalry on the Peninsula tour because probably no regiment did greater service than the 8th Illinois Cavalry. So that much of this talk is going to be relative to the 8th Illinois Cavalry once we get into the 7 days. I started off, you always put these things together and they wind up, when I first did this, it was like about an hour and a half long. So I had to cut out a lot of stuff, but I think as an overview, we should keep in mind that at First Bull Run, Irvin McDowell had about 400 cavalrymen with him. When George McClellan gave his plan to Abraham Lincoln in the War Department about what size army he needed, he asked for 25,000. Well, within 1 month of First Bull Run, he had 3,000. By September, he was asking that no more cavalry units be authorized. And by the end of the year, many of the units that had been authorized were either being consolidated or disbanded entirely due to the expense of them and the inability of the federal government to come up with enough equipment to mount them in a timely manner. McClellan would select this gentleman here, George Stoneman, as his chief of cavalry. It's important to recognize this is not a cavalry corps command. This was an administrative position. And McClellan only saw it as an administrative position. He does not have, his reputation of how to handle the cavalry is in some ways very accurate, in some ways it's not as accurate as some of us may have in mind. We'll talk about that a little bit. But he did not really envision a great role for them on the peninsula. It's interesting to note that Stoneman was 40 years of age, 4 years older than McClellan. He'd held the pre-war rank of captain and probably never commanded more than a squadron of cavalry. So when we start putting all this together on the peninsula, all of these men, cavalry and infantrymen, are working in a command they've never had before. There had never been a brigade of cavalry in any of these men's lifetime. So when you're looking at corps commanders, there's never been a corps of infantry in any of these men's lifetime, nor has it been. So he's taking a man and putting him in charge of the cavalry who'd never commanded probably more than 200 men at one time. One of his senior subordinates, this gentleman, we'll talk about him several times tonight, Philip St. George Cooke. Cooke was 53 years of age. He'd been one of the original officers with the 1st Dragoons and then spent most of his pre-war career with the 2nd Dragoons. He was in command of the regiment. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he had vast experience, had developed his own system of tactics. Some of you may have a reprint of that or an original copy. It's been reprinted many times. It was very sparsely adopted, however. So that the fact that it's easily accessible as a reprint may kind of skew the idea that it was not adopted by the cavalry on any kind of a wide scale. And he had never commanded more than a regiment. The last man up here at the moment is Colonel William Emery. Emery had been largely an engineer and an artillery officer before the war. He had minimal experience in the cavalry. He was 51 years of age. Most of his time, other than the Mexican War, had been mapping the border of the U.S. and Canada and the U.S. with Mexico. So we had a very young man in George McClellan going for age and experience, while Joseph Johnston will pick this gentleman here, James Ewell Brown, Jeb Stuart. So McClellan is 35. He goes for age and experience. The 55-year-old Joseph Johnston will completely reverse that and put a 28-year-old in command of his cavalry. By the 7 days, McClellan had all required of 5 regiments of regulars and 11 regiments of volunteers. He had absolutely no experience or desire to command volunteer cavalry. His orders are in the official record stating that he had no faith in volunteers. Most officers who had been in the Mexican War and been in a position of command had nothing but disdain for volunteers based on what had happened in the Mexican War. So McClellan put all of his faith in his regulars, but the regulars were scattered still on the plains. They were going to take time to get east, and they were poorly armed. By the 7 days, all of the regulars who had carbines had been ordered to give up their carbines. So those have been dispersed to the volunteers, and when they're called on, the men that he was going to rely on in his mind had nothing but revolvers and sabers. At different times, so this is just a snapshot, William Emery had less than 2 regiments making up a brigade. George Blake, who would only command a brigade for a very short period of time, also had less than 2 regiments. McClellan's headquarters escort consisted of 1 entire mounted regiment, the 2nd U.S. Cavalry. So one of the regiments he was going to rely on was tied up with his headquarters escort, not in the field. 4 companies from 3 different regiments, to include the 4th U.S. Cavalry, another regular regiment he was going to count on, and 6 infantry companies. His headquarters escort was bigger than those 2 brigades I just showed you. At the same time, Stuart's cavalry consisted of men from 12 regiments, battalion or legion contingents. The legion in the south was an idea where they combined in one command artillery, cavalry, and infantry. And in time, they would split those up, and all the cavalry contingents would go off and join the cavalry as separate units. And then when Stonewall Jackson will join in the 7 days, the army from the valley, he will bring the 2nd Virginia Cavalry with him. So getting into some of the things that we'll talk about on the tour a bit. Once the breakout from Yorktown happens, the next point they're going to engage is going to be Williamsburg. Williamsburg was defended by what they called the Warwick Line of fortifications. The largest fixed fortification at Williamsburg was Fort Magruder. Now it's a hotel. I think there's a marker there and not a whole lot else. But you can see here how substantial Fort Magruder was. This is a Sneeden diagram of Fort Magruder. So the cavalry will lead the advance from Yorktown to Williamsburg. So now the cavalry is doing what cavalry should do. They're out there. If you remember the famous line about the Stoneman raid the following May, that Hooker wanted him to act like an exploding shell. It'd be this idea where he was everywhere. That's in fact what the cavalry was doing as they advanced up the peninsula. And their first point of contact is going to be in front of Fort Magruder. So Stoneman and Philip St. George Cooke will be here. And most of the fighting will take place where you see the ravine down in this area right here. But there are a couple aspects of cavalry on the peninsula that you are not going to probably associate with cavalry. And the first of those are going to take place right here. Philip St. George Cooke will determine to send the 6th U.S. Cavalry, one of his regular regiments, but a completely new regiment. It had been raised since the war started. To move around by the flank, protected by the woods right here, and then these huts to attack a fixed fortification. I don't know how many other operations there were where cavalry was ordered to attack a fort that had, as you see here, a 9-foot moat and a 9-foot parapet in front of it. They were on the verge of coming through those soldiers' huts there. As you see in this trooper's description later on, we were within 30 or 40 paces of the cannoneers. They were busy with their guns and seemed to take no notice of us. A number of our men dismounted, tear down the fence leading to the rear of the earthwork. When Lieutenant Madden sternly cried out, "When we enter this fort, I want every man to cut right and left." I suspect when those men signed up for the 6th U.S. Cavalry, they didn't think their first combat operation was going to be attacking the fort. Luckily, wiser heads prevailed, because coming up from the top of the picture coming towards the fort was a command led by Lafayette McClellan, another mixed force of cavalry and infantry. And when the two sides, I think everybody was in shock. They did not believe that this could be Union cavalry getting ready to attack this fort. So the gunners didn't fire on them. McClellan is confused. He doesn't know who these troops are. When everybody realized what was actually happening, Cooke will order the 6th U.S. to withdraw. One of the things I think that we denigrate the Confederate cavalry with is the idea that they were carrying old shotguns brought from home. Now, I don't know how many people here have ever been on the business end of a shotgun before, but I don't care if it's old or not. Right? Shotgun's a shotgun. And if you think that this is not true, all you need to do is look at the compiled service records for the cavalry regiments in 1862, and you'll find the receipts where the officers signed for shotgun rounds, 5,000 shotgun rounds, 10,000 shotgun rounds. So one of the things that separated the Confederate cavalry and the Union cavalry in combat is you have to understand that cavalry was an offensive arm, but more importantly, it was a hand-to-hand arm. We have all these images of infantry moving along with fixed bayonets, but they very seldom got to bayonet point. Well, cavalry, when you're armed with a saber, it's hand-to-hand. That's it. If you charge up against a bunch of men armed with shotguns, you're at a serious disadvantage. This is a description of a fight that took place at Slatersville. This is then Captain Charles Russell Lowell, the private's talking about. Our captain rode after a retreating Reb with a shotgun on his shoulder. The Reb threw the gun over his arm and fired it at our captain. Luckily for Lowell, the shot lodged in his overcoat that he had on the saddle behind him. It would have been very easy to cut off the barrel and control that from horseback. Another thing we probably don't think about with cavalry, especially early in the war, is the amphibious operations they were involved in. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Eltham's Landing or West Point operation. When the Army was bogged down at Yorktown, McClellan had the idea that he was going to send infantry supported by cavalry on ship up the York-Pamunkey River to land behind the Yorktown line, kind of like MacArthur would do at Incheon in Korea, get behind the line and then force them to retire. Johnston will fall back from Yorktown before that can happen. But McClellan will still decide to launch the operation anyway. It's not a great success, but he will put the 1st New York Cavalry on ships, send them up the river to work as part of that operation there. Again, I don't think anyone that signed up with the 1st New York Cavalry thought they were going to be going into their first battle off of a ship. Hopefully this map can be seen fairly well there. So if you're working up the peninsula towards Richmond, here's Williamsburg down here. And the cavalry is constantly probing towards the rivers, the river crossings, the ferry crossings, Burn Ordinary. You'll see that in some of the accounts of the 8th Illinois. That's not called Burn Ordinary today. I believe that's now called Toano. If we drive through that, going up from Williamsburg, Barnesville. This is Eltham's Landing over here. I just mentioned, and then the fight at Slatersville with the 6th U.S. Cavalry is up here in this area. By the time we get to mid-May, the cavalry has led the advance into Mechanicsville. So Mechanicsville is where the 7 days was essentially going to start. And Stoneman's cavalry has been in the advance all the way up there. And on that day, they are skirmishing with an artillery unit commanded by this gentleman here. You probably know more with the Confederate cavalry, Tom Roster. But he's in command of the Washington artillery at that time, and he will take a wound in the arm during the skirmish. And by the end of the campaign, he will be in command of the 5th Virginia Cavalry. about, and it depends on who you read, but by as early as May 10th, the Federal Cavalry had got to White House. This is the home of Rooney Lee. This is on the site of supposedly where George Washington first met his bride-to-be, but it was not that house at the time, but this is passed down to Rooney Lee from the Custis family. And this would become the main supply depot for the early part of the 7 days, or the early part of the campaign, up to the early part of the 7 days. When they got there, Mrs. Robert E. Lee and one of her daughters were staying there. It would become a point of contention because it was going to seriously impact one man's career, and that was Major Lawrence Williams of the 6th U.S. Cavalry. He had known the Lee family, and he was one of those men early in the war who was seen as a Southerner who had stayed with the North. And he would continue to try to make visits to see Mrs. Lee, and it would get him in a lot of trouble where he was suspected of being a traitor. Lee will then leave that home and go to this home. And I apologize, it's not a great view of it, but it's been a long time since I knew the man that lived there, and I wasn't going to go driving up his driveway when I was there in the fall to take these pictures. This is Marlborough. This was the Edmund Ruffin home. I'm sure that name is familiar to all of you as the ardent secessionist. This is Marlborough. We'll probably, again, this is one of those things we'll be very close to, I suspect, but we're not going to drive 2 buses in there. On May 24th, the 6th U.S. Cavalry, or the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry, is scouting around, and they'll go knock on the door of Marlborough, and now Mrs. Lee's been disturbed again. She was reportedly highly indignant at the second disturbance, and one of her daughter supposedly lectured the soldiers on the duties of chivalry to women. Over the next couple of days, there would be a truce worked out where the Federals would escort Mrs. Lee and her daughter to the Confederate lines, and she would not be disturbed again. When we get down towards, which plantation are we going to?
Berkeley.
Berkeley Plantation. We'll be in the area. All those plantations are kind of along the James River. The Federal Cavalry would make connections with the Navy in the James River. Again, it was the cavalry that did it. So as they're working the fringes of the Army, Colonel William Averill of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry will be given the duty to make contact with the Federal Navy. They will do so from Shirley Plantation, and the several cavalrymen will get in a rowboat, row out to the Navy to notify them where they establish communications and get the support of the Navy as they continue up the river. Any of you, just as an aside, follow the AMC show called Turn, the Revolutionary War show? Much of that was filmed, I believe, at Shirley Plantation. I believe one of the plantations on the James River, I think, is Shirley Plantation. At the same time, there's a controversy, and again, I'm sure most of you are aware of this, where when McClellan organized his force for the Peninsula Campaign, he, in the minds of Lincoln and Stanton, stripped all the men from the defenses of Washington. They would become a point of contention between McClellan and his superiors, and they would order that McClellan leave McDowell's entire infantry corps behind to defend Washington. McClellan will continue to try to get them, and they will slowly, McDowell, work his way down to Falmouth, north of Fredericksburg. So by late May, McDowell's at Falmouth, and right at that point, Lincoln is on the verge of saying, you can go ahead to McClellan. That's going to change because out in the Shenandoah Valley, Stonewall Jackson's working his mischief, and McDowell will be diverted. But when they think this is going to happen, McClellan will order Fitzjohn Porter's 5th Corps with most of the cavalry to go open an avenue for him. That will result in the Hanover expedition and the Battle of Hanover Courthouse. Luckily for our purposes here today, the only illustration I know of the Battle of Hanover Courthouse just happens to show the 6th U.S. Cavalry. We were talking a little bit today with some people at lunch. This was perfect demonstration of how both sides, so we all think of McClellan not knowing how to utilize his cavalry. Both sides misused their cavalry in a set-piece combat operation. They had nothing else to do with them, so they would tell them to go out and support the artillery. Cavalry was offensive. They couldn't hold ground in 1862. That would change by the summer of 1863. The only thing they could do if that cavalry got into trouble, and we'll talk about it again in a minute, is two things. They could attack or retreat. They can't stand there and fend anybody off with their sabers. So this is just making a counter-battery target, a bigger target, and imagine being a man on a horse while you're standing around being shelled. It was not a popular place to be. If you think I'm an apologist for the cavalry, Bobby Crick is not. And he would say that the misuse of the 6th U.S. offers a graphic example of how Civil War commanders struggled early in the war to use their mounted arm properly. This is one of the maps that went with an essay Bobby did on Hanover Courthouse. I only use it here to orient you with a couple of locations / church and the Dr. Kinney home known as the Elms. There's the 6th U.S. or the battery that the 6th U.S. is defending, and you see how close it is to the main fighting of the Battle of Hanover Courthouse. So this is the Elms as it was last October when I took these pictures. This would feature prominently any number of times during the Civil War. The Stuarts right around McClellan goes past the Kinney home, and I will show you on a map how it will figure here again in a couple of minutes. And this is / church as it is today. I'm not a historian of / church. I'm sure it was not that big in 1862, but it is at least part of that is the original church from the Civil War. Again, one of these maps, I hope you can see this back there. The area to the right over here is a blow-up of the area right here. So you see the Battle of / Church here. And when that was over with, the cavalry had been sent there for a second purpose. They weren't expected necessarily to support the 5th Corps in an infantry battle. But their orders were the following day to destroy as much infrastructure as they could around there. So namely, they were going to burn all the bridges, railroad and road bridges over the South Anna River. All the railroad tracks they could tear up. They were going to destroy Ashland Station. And this was the key point as we get into the 7 days, because again, to quote Bobby Crick, the loss of those bridges and their accompanying rail lines halted Confederate efforts well into the 7 days, one month later. We're going to talk about that. The actual impact of that here in just a couple of minutes. So again, a snapshot of how the Union cavalry was deployed, looking at June 20th, on the cusp of the 7 days. You see Stoneman, with his cavalry command, only has about 1,000 troopers with him. But remember what I said about these corps commanders. None of them had fought an infantry corps before. They were all learning. They had no idea until now how to fight an infantry corps in combat. And now they've been saddled with close to 1,000 men themselves of cavalry. They have no idea how to fight. So they were all learning on the job. So a few minutes on the ride around McClellan. I'm not going to go into that in any detail. But it's generally framed as a contest between Jeb Stuart and his father-in-law. Flora Cooke, Stuart's wife, was Philip St. George Cooke's daughter. Cooke was born in Virginia. He was born near Leesburg. And when he decided to stay with the Federals and honor his oath, Stuart reportedly said he will regret that but once, and that will be forever. And it was said, and I think this is maybe a little bit more open to question than what I just repeated to you, that he hoped to meet his father-in-law in combat and have a chance to kill him. So this is the way we generally frame what happened on the ride around McClellan, and why Cooke detractors think he was not aggressive enough to pursue Stuart in time to catch him. He didn't want to catch her. He didn't want to confront his son-in-law. I would offer to you that another way to look at it is an issue of Fitzjohn Porter versus Philip St. George Cooke. So why would I say this? One of the things that I think we often forget to do is look at what these men did pre-war. Philip St. George Cooke was a very difficult person to get along with. Current historian Paul Andrew Hutton described Cooke as imperious. Historian Durward Ball did a book on the Army right before the Civil War, turned him eccentric, a romantic at heart who pined for armed combat. I think he absolutely did. Even his friends like Wesley Merritt, who was a staff officer of his in the 7 days in the Peninsula, would say that he really did want to lead kind of a Napoleonic cavalry charge at some point. He suffered neither fools nor knaves, had a buckshot tongue, and was the Army's best all-around antebellum officer. I think the last part is open to argument, but I think it's less open to argument that he was the most experienced officer in the antebellum Army. In 1838, while he was stationed in present-day Oklahoma, in the middle of nowhere, he accidentally shot his wife in the mouth with a pistol and knocked about half her teeth out. They were so far out in the middle of nowhere that he couldn't get a leave to take her to a dentist for over a year.
Oh, geez.
Historian Will Gornfeld, who has just in the last few months released a book on the early career of the First Dragoons, he sees Cooke as a bully and seems to hint that this may not have been an accidental shooting.
Really?
He was a stickler for minutiae of military regulations. So now you can look at a lot of this stuff online if you're familiar with something like Fold 3 or things like that. Years ago when I was looking at them in the archives, I wish I'd copied them down. We think of certain men in history as being a pain in the you-know-what because of what the little arguments they would pick. So going forward a few years, we look at George Custer maybe that way, and how they fought with their subordinates. Another way to look at that, I think, is the fact that these men had absolutely nothing to do when in garrison to entertain themselves. There's no television, there's no music per se, there's no Xbox or whatever it is. They would just generate letters. Imagine what it cost to send a letter from Utah to Washington and back again. And the more letters you kept in the train, the more you had coming across your desk to keep you occupied. So Cooke will argue while he's in Utah about the length of a man's beard or mustache, why he won't trim it to what he thinks is the regulation. He will also argue over a very small point of military protocol with Albert Sidney Johnston repeatedly. Well, who was Albert Sidney Johnston's adjutant, the man who got all of this paperwork, but then Major Fitzjohn Porter? Cooke was a lieutenant colonel, and to some extent, Porter had to put up with it because he was outranked by him. When they get to the 7 days, Porter's a major general, and he's McClellan's right-hand man, and Cooke is only a brigadier general. You want to get back at somebody who gave you a hard time all those years earlier, I don't think it was forgotten, and I think that plays into what will happen. While he's in Utah, Cooke will be accused of being a Southerner. He'll be accused essentially of being disloyal. One of the men who's written up with him is John Gibbon. Both of them will be cleared. You can find that paperwork now. It's been put on to the Fold 3 website. He had turned down, Cooke had a offered commission by the Confederate government to lead Missouri troops in battle. He turned it down. He said, I owe Virginia nothing. I owe my country everything. But suspicion clung to him. Most of the paperwork you see generated in the official records during this period of time dealing with the cavalry is dated from this location here, Old Church. This is an 1864 image of Old Church with Union cavalry horses in front of it. And this is Old Church today, obviously much bigger building than it was in 1864, but you get a still sense of the trees in front of the old part of it there. Part of the problem with Stuart's ride around McClellan from a federal standpoint is they have one combat operation in there. All of McClellan's 1,200 troopers will confront a detachment of the 5th U.S. Cavalry and overwhelm them. So one of the young lieutenants in the 5th U.S. will report, as Philip St. George Cooke's report, that he had seen from 3 to 5 regiments of infantry as well as artillery. Colonel Gouverneur Warren, commanding an infantry brigade, he will report that Burns told him he'd seen as many as 7 regiments of infantry. Well, if all you have is cavalry going up against cavalry and infantry, you're going to be at a disadvantage. So what did Porter tell Cooke? He gave him a series of conflicting orders. Tell him to hold your own, maintain your position. Do not attack with cavalry alone to combine superior force of the enemy. Well, how are you going to catch cavalry moving at the rate of infantry? Probably not going to happen. But then Porter would try to have it both ways. And he would blame Cooke for tying his legs with an infantry command. No, Cooke did that at Porter's order. But Cooke is not his own, he's maybe his own worst enemy. Because when it comes to writing official reports, we all know how everybody tried to make themselves in the best light. Not Philip St. George Cooke. He will write that not feeling well, I returned to my tent to get a cup of coffee after he sent the infantry out. Well, when you got Confederate infantry or cavalry riding around your army, you probably don't want to tell posterity that you went to your tent to get a cup of coffee. But if you think of that, you can move faster. His cavalry needed to be, their horses needed to get food and fodder. His men needed to come in off the picket line. I think what he was thinking was, I can get Warren's infantry out there, and then if they get into trouble, I can catch up with them quicker than if you do it the reverse. Posterity doesn't look at it like that. The cavalry combat between the 5th U.S. and Stuart's command will take place between an area known as Linney's Corner and Enon Church. Again, an image today of Enon Church, most probably better well known because it's on the Hawes Shop battlefield, May 28, 1864. This is a much later image of Captain William Royal as a colonel. I don't know how well you can see it right here. There's a saber scar running right up the side of his face right there. Believe that Royal, as a captain, was the man who engaged Captain William Latney of the 9th Virginia Cavalry in armed combat. Royal would wind up with between 4 and 6 saber wounds and not return to a combat command during the war. But for the fact that this painting was done in 1864, William Latney would probably have passed into obscurity as one of the few casualties that Stuart will suffer on that ride. This was used as a fundraiser to raise money for the Confederate government after it was released. This is Ashland Station. On the cusp of the 7 days, the 8th New York, or the 8th Illinois, will be sent back to Ashland Station to burn the depot then. And after the 7 days, or after the ride, McClellan would very foolishly try to take the sting out of the reports that had been very favorable to Stuart. So he sent his own men on a raid. Stuart had gone around the army. McClellan had the bright idea to send his cavalry off somewhere completely the opposite direction of the enemy, where they were never going to get into any kind of trouble. So he sends them to King William Courthouse, and he will try to say that I think we're now about even with Stuart. This is a surprise party we're paying for his raid. The Southern Richmond papers were absolutely excoriated McClellan for thinking that he was going to match Stuart's raid with this effort into the rear. Averell would again see this as the last chance to open an avenue for McDowell, but McDowell will go to the Shenandoah Valley. So in the 7 days, Jackson will come east to meet with Lee on June 23rd, and then he's going to have to go back to Gordonsville. Remember, the railroad bridges have been disrupted, the railroad's been torn up. Then he's going to bring his men back. He is expected to be available on 26th of June to coordinate with Lee's opening offensive at Mechanicsville. Stuart, with 5 regiments, was to protect his left flank. Jackson's line of march was largely picketed by the 8th Illinois Cavalry and elements of the 5th, 6th, and U.S. Cavalry near the Potomac River. I was lucky to get Dave Roth at Blue and Gray to do a couple of maps for me. So I showed you earlier Slash Church, and I showed you the Elms. In part, I showed you this is Jackson's route, so he'll come right to Slash Church and then turn south. Stuart will continue a little bit east and then turn south at the Elms, coming down towards Mechanicsville. So I want to talk a couple minutes about the area of Half Sink and French Hay. And this roughly approximates the Union cavalry picket lines that they're going to encounter. Also, Lawrence O'Brien Branch's army or brigade had been sent up from Lee to connect with Jackson as he came south. Just out of curiosity, how well does that map show up to those of you in the back? Can you see it fairly well? Thank you. So this is I believe, a southern account, talking about during an almost continual skirmish with Branch's brigade between the Half Sink crossing, French Hay, and Cedar Grove, the 8th Illinois lost a guidon. We're talking today, I think that guidon is not lost in combat. I think it's actually forgotten in the haste to get out of one of the locations I'll show you here in a minute. So this is Half Sink today. The combat on the 26th of June, the day of the Battle of Mechanicsville, will actually start near this location right here. This is present-day Route 1 looking north, right at the Hanover-Henrico County line, and this is the Chickahominy River looking east from that bridge right there. The old Civil War crossing was somewhere in here. Route 1 today mirrors much of what was then the old Telegraph Road, and parts of the Telegraph Road still survive on either side of the Chickahominy. There's no longer a bridge crossing there. So the 8th Illinois will be combating Lawrence O'Brien Branch's infantry and Ewell's infantry at this point. I suspect an area that probably none of you have seen, and even I'm hoping Ed Bars hasn't seen it, is this home right here. This is French Hay. It's a colonial era home. It was here back before the Revolution. And it may be gone by the time we're there in a couple of months. As you can see, the wings of the house are gone. It's boarded up. It's in a heavy industrial area now. And it was for sale. The Chickahominy River runs right in that tree line right there. And this was the large reserve picket post for the 8th Illinois while they're fighting at Half Sink. So their next fallback position is at this point right here. Continuing that map from before, going south. Again, this is now Ewell and Branch coming down here. Jackson and Stuart moving over here. I'll talk briefly about the home right here. Cedar Grove, Shady Grove Church, Walnut Grove Church, Pole Green Church, and the Totopotomoy River, and also up here Oak Forest and Hickory Well. Give you an idea. So again, Stuart and Jackson are coming down here. This is Porter and the 5th Corps that's going to be involved in the Battle of Mechanicsville later that day. A.P. Hill's advanced with D.H. Hill, the infantry from Lee's army, coming across the Chickahominy River. This is Cedar Grove. Most accounts in the ORs refer to this as the Widow Crenshaw House. This still stands. Unfortunately, for my purposes and our purposes, to try to see the home, the folks that live there now are apparently very ardent arborists and have a lot of flowers. So they have a deer fence over around the house that's about 10 feet high. So you can look through the chain link and see about this much of it through all the trees around it. But I doubt it's changed much. It's now in the midst of a subdivision. So all the land that was there was gone. This was the next reserve picket post for the 8th Illinois coming south. And that guidon was probably captured at this point right here, or lost or left here. By this point, the cavalry was falling back in front of the Confederate infantry coming north to south, and A.P. Hill's infantry are coming west to east across the Chickahominy, and things are going to heat up enough that an entire infantry company of the Pennsylvania Reserves will be captured near this location. This is Oak Forest. It also still stands, but it's way back in the trees off the road, and again, I wasn't going to drive up the house. Probably the first officer killed in combat for the 8th Illinois Cavalry is mortally wounded a mile and a half from this home. Rufus Hooker was out with Major Daniel Dustin scouting the pickets and the advance of the infantry, the Confederate infantry. When he gets a bullet wound in the lower abdomen, his men will hold him in the saddle for a mile and a half until they get to Oak Forest. They will leave him there, thinking that they're going to be able to get an ambulance or a wagon and come back and recover him. Unfortunately, the Confederate infantry will overrun that position, and his body is never recovered. Immediately across the street from it is this home Hickory Well. This would be where Stuart would meet with Jackson and spend some time that afternoon, again on the 26th, while the cavalry of both sides is fighting for possession of the Potomac Bridge. This would involve probably parts of the 8th Illinois, but mostly the 5th and 6th U.S. Cavalry against the 1st Virginia, and then elements of the Texas Brigade under Hood to take this bridge, but the Federals burned it before they gave it up. This is what is now Mark's Pole Green Church. I suspect many of you have seen this, maybe on an overland expedition or a tour. It was burned in 1864. This was Jackson's. This is the point they expected him to get to that night, but by the time he gets there, it's going to be too late for him to effect the fighting at Mechanicsville. Shady Grove Church, there's nothing at all historic about this picture. It was a wife taking a picture of a church that wasn't there in 1862. Shady Grove Church in 1862 was immediately across the road from where it is now. I can show you a picture of a field, or I can show you a picture of the new church. This was the next fallback position for the 8th Illinois Cavalry, and their highest command, if John Farnsworth was there, this is probably where he was. They would fight Brownie Johnson's 1st Maryland Infantry near here. And Walnut Grove Church, this is original. The 8th Illinois used this as a field hospital. This is pretty close to the Mechanicsville battlefield. Lee will meet with A.P. Hill and Jackson at Walnut Grove Church the following morning before the Battle of Gaines Mill. And they say that, like many of these locations, if you were to take up the flooring in the oldest part of the church, there's still a lot of blood from the soldiers that were treated there. So Cooke's cavalry charge at Gaines Mill. Porter would tell us that Cooke charged through his guns and prohibited the guns from firing to defend themselves, and they led to the confusion that led to them being lost in battle. But remember what I said. Porter ordered Cooke's cavalry to defend the guns. Remember what I said about their ability to actually do so. As the line finally begins to deteriorate, Porter will send Wesley Merritt to Cooke will send Wesley Merritt to Porter asking for orders, and Porter will ignore him. He will give him no orders and leave Cooke to determine what he's going to do on his own. Cooke will order a charge. So you have either Porter's view of how they charged, or you have Wesley Merritt's view of how they charged, not through the guns, but around the flank. The charge is only made by about 220 men of the 5th U.S. Cavalry. All the other cavalry that was in reserve would not make the charge. They would lose about 58 men killed, wounded, or captured in a couple of minutes. This is looked on as the great debacle of the Federal Cavalry in the 7 days. This will also be the end of Philip St. George Cooke's career, military or wartime career. He will be in the Army much longer, but he will never be in a combat command again. Again, if anyone thinks I'm an apologist for the Federal Cavalry, Bobby Crick said of Porter that he tainted an otherwise excellent performance that day by falsely accusing Cooke, by dishonestly asserting that Cooke alone was responsible for a failure to hold the battlefield. This was, I think, the final chance for Porter to get back at whatever problems he'd had with Cooke earlier before the war. When they give up, when Porter's forced back at Gaines Mill, they will have to give up the supply depot at White House Landing and shift it over to the James River. So McClellan will order Stoneman to go over to White House, help them evacuate the supplies and the troops, and then Stoneman is to retreat up the peninsula to Yorktown. So by 7 o'clock on the 28th, all of the troops at White House Landing are on ships out in the river. About 4:30 in the afternoon, White House itself went up in flames. And many of the accounts will blame that on the Federal Cavalry. Almost certainly, it was burned by a sergeant of the 93rd New York at the direction of 2 unnamed captains. The 93rd New York had been assigned by McClellan as the personal guard of White House itself. They spent the whole time, about a month there, and they didn't appreciate the fact that they'd been tasked with guarding a trader's home, so they put the torch to it. It is still smoldering when Rooney Lee, the owner of the home, will ride up the next morning. One of the ships that was there that was holding federal troops was the USS Marblehead, commanded by Lieutenant Somerville Nicholson. Nicholson had been off the river, off the home for a period of time, out in the Virginia humidity with nothing to do, and he decided he wanted a chance to contest Stuart's cavalry. They had been ordered, all the ships had been ordered once they were loaded to sail down the river to Yorktown. He will reportedly tell his superiors that he has run aground. It's a tidal river, and he's not able to leave. That's a lie, so that he could be there when Jeb Stuart arrives the next morning. This is a Mort Kunstler diagram. So again, one of the things you don't think the cavalry was probably involved in on the 7 days of the peninsula is a ship to cavalry operation. The Federals will actually put men in a rowboat, send them back from the ship to the shore, contest Stuart's advance. But you have a much more concentrated target in that ship than you do with a bunch of scattered troopers. So it was easier for Stuart to run that ship off and vice versa. The men will be forced back to the ship. John McClellan's artillery will begin to shell it and force the ship down the river. Stuart was very happy to do this. That's his quote up there. He knew the Navy because of the way the peninsula is framed by the York and James rivers. He knew the Navy was going to be a factor, and he didn't want his men to be afraid of these ships, so he was more than happy to order his men to dismount and begin sniping at it, what he called the great Yankee bugaboo called gunboat. And you can be sure they took great pride in the fact that they drove it off. Willis Church on May 29th, this is the day of the Battle of Savage Station. Willis Church is on the Glendale battlefield. I suspect we'll see this when we're talking about Glendale. What goes unnoticed most of the time when we talk about the great debacle of Cooke's cavalry charge and the 58 men that were lost is that on the 28th, William Averill will lead the 1st North Carolina into an ambush. He set up a classic, almost an L-shaped ambush with artillery and cavalry. 1st North Carolina is commanded by a gentleman over on the right, Lawrence Baker. His men would accuse him of being intoxicated, and he was lured into this ambush where he lost about 60 men in 5 minutes, killed, wounded, or captured. So we all pretty much have a sense of Cooke's attack at Gaines Mill. Most of us have probably never heard of the affair that happened in Willis Church. But in fact, the cavalry was much more evenly matched than history leads us to believe. And to kind of wrap this up pretty quick, once McClellan has retired to Harrison's Landing, Stuart and Pelham will go out to find him. And when they do locate him, Stuart will dutifully send some couriers back to Lee to let him know we found the Union Army. Then he will very curiously, before Lee can do anything strategic to take advantage of it, order Pelham to begin shelling the camp. So the Federals will be alerted that they've been found, they'll deploy their men, and any advantage that Lee would have had will be wasted. On the 31st of July, the Confederates this is the James River looking from Harrison's Landing across to what was known as Maycox or Coggins Point. The Confederates will deploy about 40 artillery pieces across the river, and they will shell the camp with about 1,000 artillery rounds. The next morning, McClellan will order another amphibious operation, cavalry and infantry, to board ships, go across the James River, and ensure that they had no cover again. So they burned all the home and outbuildings that were there. So this was known as Maycox. It was rented, I believe, at the time, if that's the right word, by Mrs. William Cole. But this was another property owned by Edmund Ruff. And lastly, August 5th, the cavalry will be part of an operation ordered by McClellan to kind of He's already been told roughly to give up the campaign. The War Department's going to focus on John Pope and the Army of Virginia. He's to move back up and move to Pope's support. He doesn't want to do that. He will try to instigate one more operation to draw attention back to him. He'll send the 8th Illinois with some other cavalry along with infantry into a fight at Malvern Hill, where William Gamble in the center will take a bullet wound through the right lung. So just to conclude it, I'll use a letter from Thomas Kelly, the 8th Illinois. Kelly was one of the men on the famous picket post at Gettysburg when the first shot was fired. Kelly wrote, "We were a crack regiment, we were full, and I'd like to see them all together as we were when we left Washington. But that can never be, as some have gone to another and better world, and others are disabled for life. What men we have got are good soldiers, and brave ones too." I thank you for your time, and if we have any time left, I'll try to answer any questions you may have. No questions? Put you all to sleep?